So I'm Courtney Johnson. I'm actually an attorney here in Portland. I'm and the executive director at Crag Law Center, a nonprofit. And I represent the Nez Perce tribe on the trustee council. Lauren Sinker is here too. She's with the NOAA Restoration Center. So we just thought we might just do a quick overview of kind of who we are and what we do. So if we can go to the next slide, I think I just have a quick, like, what are the things? So what is NERDA, or NERDAR, sometimes referred to? Who is the Natural Resource Trustee Council for Portland Harbor? And what do we do? These are the kind of basic things we thought we could start with. And I think, Debbie, to your point, there are these two sides. And so kind of separating out what the cleanup is from what the restoration is, I think it's a place that I think we could all continue to use help in figuring out those two pieces. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Lucila. So this is kind of the technical definition of what we're doing. And the Natural Resource Damage Assessment, or Natural Resource Damage Assessment and Restoration, that would be NERDAR, is a process that the natural resources trustees undertake to assess natural resource injuries and service losses that result from the release of hazardous substances. And this is really part of CERCLA, or the Superfund law. There's some other Oil Pollution Act and Clean Water Act provisions that also kind of pull this all together. But it really is a kind of complementary piece to the cleanup. And the Department of Interior actually put together, I think pretty recently, a little video that kind of explains what it is too. So we thought we could show that as well. And then maybe just talk a little bit more in detail about what it is that we're actually doing. So maybe we could show that video.
Hello, and welcome to this brief introduction to Natural Resource Damage Assessment and Restoration, also known as NERDAR. Within the U.S. Department of the Interior, we use the NERDAR process to evaluate injuries to public natural resources following a toxic spill or release and assist in their restoration. Why do we need NERDAR? When oil and hazardous substances are spilled or released into the environment, public natural resources may be injured or destroyed. Federal law provides that these natural resources should be restored or replaced. That's why several laws were passed. The Clean Water Act is the primary law regulating water quality and pollution in the United States. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, aka Superfund, provides federal authority to respond to and clean up spills and hazardous waste sites. And the Oil Pollution Act improved the government's ability to respond to oil spills in the nation's waters. So what does this process look like? Well, when harmful substances are released into the environment, local fish, wildlife, and plants can be injured, and the public's use of these resources may be impaired. NERDAR conducts investigations to determine the nature, extent, and severity of this injury and how it might be fixed. We work with other federal, state, and tribal government partners as natural resource trustees acting on behalf of the public during this process. Next, a claim is resolved through settlement or in rare cases through litigation. Lastly, funds recovered are used to restore, replace, enhance, or protect the natural resources affected, or to compensate the public for the lost use of the resource. While this may sound simple, it requires understanding a wide range of complex ecosystems around the U.S. and the unique public resources associated with each. The NERDAR program allows Americans to continue to enjoy public natural resources that are safe for recreation. Visit doi.gov/restoration for more information.
Thanks, Lucila. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to make sure we talk a little bit about that split, that breakdown between the EPA-led cleanup and the NERDA restoration. So one of the ways, it's kind of a simple way to think about it, but the way that I like to think about it is that the cleanup is really primarily forward-looking. So cleaning up the river sediments to prevent risk to human health and the environment in the future, but that's not filling those gaps about all the injury that occurred to those natural resources in the past. And so that's really one of the ways that I kind of think about what the goals of the two pieces are. is that the EPA-led cleanup is really trying to protect future health and future environment conditions, and that the NRDA is trying to essentially compensate the public for its inability to fully use all of these resources in the past as a result from that contamination. And so EPA and DEQ are really overseeing the cleanup side, and the Trustee Council oversees that restoration side, that natural resource damage assessment and restoration side. So I'm going to pass it over to Lauren to talk a little bit more about who we are and more specifics about what we're doing, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful framework for, how we got here.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So I will just pick it up by sharing a little bit about specifically who the Trustee Council is. So the Portland Harbor Trustee Council, we were formed in 2002 to conduct the natural resource damage assessment for Portland Harbor. We're composed of federal, state, and tribal trustees. We have 5 tribal trustees. Yakama Nation is also a natural resource trustee for Portland Harbor, but does not participate in the Trustee Council. The 5 tribes that do are listed here on the screen. They're the Grand Ronde, Nez Perce, Siletz, Umatilla, and Warm Springs. And then we have 2 federal agencies represented on the Trustee Council, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who I work for, and then the U.S. Department of the Interior. And then we have 1 state agency, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that's who the Trustee Council is. And if we move on to the next slide, I have just a little description of, at a high level what we do. So the Trustee Council, like that video was describing, we're evaluating how contamination in Portland Harbor has injured natural resources like salmon and bald eagle and river otter you see on the screen, as well as services that the natural resources provide, like recreation and clean water and cultural resources. So we kind of have this, roughly this 3-step process that you see on the screen. We assess how the natural resources and services were injured by contamination over time. We develop plans to restore, rehabilitate, or replace those injured natural resources. And then we seek compensation from the parties that are responsible for the contamination to implement the plan that we developed in the previous step. If you move us to the next slide, Lucila, you can see these are some of the potentially injured natural resources that we're the most focused on in Portland Harbor. Fish like salmon, lamprey, and sturgeon, birds like bald eagle and osprey, mammals like mink and river otter, as well as invertebrates, sediments, soils, water. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ones we're the most focused on. And then on the next slide, when we talk about services, we're talking generally about 3 categories. We think of the services that we're trying to restore in ecological, tribal, and recreation. So these services, we believe, have been impacted by contamination in Portland Harbor. Ecological services include things like habitat, food, hydrologic system, the existence value of natural resources. That category of ecological injury is a lot of what the restoration projects that we come out to the public, the restoration banks that we're talking to you all about often, those fit primarily under that ecological category. But there are also tribal services that have been impacted, like cultural resources, traditions, and other services that are unique to the tribes. And then recreation, like we were talking about a bit before we started this presentation, we know activities like boating and fishing and wildlife observation have also been impacted by the contamination in Portland Harbor. So we're working ultimately to restore each of those categories of services. And I think I just have one more slide here to just note the 4 ecological restoration projects. These are the places where we can kind of demonstrate the most progress in what the natural resource damage assessment has resulted in thus far. The Alder Creek, Linton, Harborton, and Rainierson Creek restoration projects have all been constructed. All 4 of those restoration projects have been built using the restoration banking model, where there's a for-profit company that has come in and built the projects to sell credits to the responsible parties from Portland Harbor, and they can then use those credits in settlements with the Trustee Council. All 4 of those projects have been highlighted in the Trustee Council's restoration plans in the past. And we've sought, public input on them along the way. And that's a lot of what, at the CAG meeting we joined in April and in future meetings where we focus a lot of our communications. But there are also, many assessment plans, assessment studies, and other forms of planning that we've been doing along the way that we publish and come out to the public to talk about. On the topic of restoring tribal resources, I did just want to note that there is a component at each of these restoration projects where specific research or studies are being done to understand the use of these habitats by lamprey, because lamprey are a species that are of particular significance to the tribes. And so that additional monitoring around lamprey to better understand their use of the lower river is one way in which we're trying to restore services for the tribes through our work in the natural resource damage assessment. And then like Courtney started to talk about a little bit earlier, recreation planning is kind of our next big frontier that we're planning to come to the public to talk about. We're just starting to gear up for that and conducting some really early outreach around that. But hoping to ultimately come out with a plan around recreation the public can comment on in the future. So that was just, we wanted to provide this sort of, entry level kind of just presentation, really focus on what the natural resource damage assessment is, because a lot of times we jump straight into talking about these projects, and I think sometimes we don't have the time or space to really dig into what is this natural resource damage assessment process and how does it relate to the cleanup or not. So that was part of what we wanted to cover here and make time for, and answer any questions you might have about that topic. And the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll zip it, but is this is our website up on the screen here for anyone who wants to follow that to learn a little more about what we're doing. You can also sign up for our newsletter there to stay up to speed on what we're up to and be informed about our work. Yeah, those are the things we wanted to cover in this short presentation, and then hopefully have more questions and discussion with you all.